Support your immune system with Airborne's most complete immune support formula yet. Airborne's delicious effervescent tablets are packed with 7 powerful ingredients to fill the holes your immune system may have, so that you can enjoy those unmissable moments in your life. Learn more at airbornecomplete.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Look around. You can find cars like these on AutoTrader, like that car riding your tail. Or if you're tailgating right now, all those cars doubling as kitchens and living rooms are on AutoTrader too. Are you working out and listening to this ad at the same time? Well, multitasking pro, cars like the ones in the gym parking lot are for sale on AutoTrader. New cars, used cars, electric cars, maybe even flying cars. Okay, no flying cars, but as soon as they get invented, they'll be on AutoTrader. Just you wait. AutoTrader.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very, very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
I'm your huckleberry.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away by its title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all the ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation that somehow, films manage to get made. Each regular episode of Film Stories, I'm talking about 2 different movies and telling you their tales, and that's exactly what's going to happen this time as well. Let's kick off with the first of those films, and I'm going to play you, as always, a clip from the trailer. I'm going to come to the story the other side of this.
It was a place where a man could start over, where a fortune could be made. They say every town has a story. Tombstone has a legend.
Who is he?
That's Wyatt Earp. Made a name for himself as a peace officer.
I heard of you.
I'm retired.
You must be Doc Holliday. You retired too?
Not me. I'm in my prime.
Hollywood Pictures presents
The only real law around here is the cowboys.
the story of Wyatt Earp.
The first time in our lives we got a chance to stop wandering and finally be a family. Now this is trouble we don't need.
If we're gonna have a future in this town, it's gotta have some law and order. What do you want, Ringo?
I want your blood. I want your soul.
That then was a clip from 1993's Tombstone, directed by, we'll come to this, George P. Cosmatos, written by Kevin Shah. And here's a cast list. The length of these podcasts has been slowly increasing, and with the length of the cast list for Tombstone, this one's going to go like forever, I think. So, deep breath. Kurt Russell, Val Kilmer, Michael Biehn, Powers Booth, Robert Burke, Dana Delaney, Sam Elliott, Stephen Long, Joanna Pakula, Bill Paxton, Jason Priestley, Michael Rooker, John Tenney, Billy Zane, and Charlton Heston. An incredible cast list, but one heck of a film story, this as well. So, the story of Tombstone, it goes back to the early 1990s. The film itself actually came together, when you consider all the trouble I'm about to talk about, really rather quickly. And so one of the historical consultants on the film was a man called Jeff Murray, and he was talking to True West magazine that's done some terrific articles on Tombstone. And he revealed in July 1991, a writer by the name of Kevin Jarre got in touch with him. And as Maury explains, we had a wide-ranging discussion about Wyatt's life for about an hour and a half. So this is Wyatt Earp, which I figure you've probably pieced together from the clip of the trailer up there. A legendary American lawman and the whole legend of the OK Corral and the gunfight at the OK Corral. And so the idea of bringing the Wyatt Earp story to screen, well, that very much appealed to Kevin Jarre, and Jeff Murray, as a historical consultant, this was very much in his wheelhouse as well. And so the next day, as Murray explained, Kevin called me to say he wanted to write a script about Tombstone and that he wanted me to be his historical consultant. Now, Jeff Murray admits to being flabbergasted by this and recommended that Kevin Jarre talk to some other Wyatt Earp experts and researchers. And then Kevin Jarre just came back and said, well, no, actually, I want you. And so the pair started working on it. It was quite an informal working arrangement. And what would happen is Kevin Jarre would invite Jeff Murray over to his home. They'd cook some food, they'd get some beer in, they'd have a couple of drinks, they'd had something to eat, and they talked about the story. And it wasn't a case that Kevin Jarre came to these meals and these meetups with a big list of questions. As Jeff Murray explains, he never took notes. Kevin was already familiar with the Earp literature, so he didn't need help in getting the outline of the story straight. His questions often dealt with motives. It was a lot of research and it was a lot of work to turn in a script. And in June 1992, the first screenplay for what would become Tombstone was then completed. So I'm just so we've got a bit of background on Kevin Jarre at this point. A successful Hollywood writer. He'd written the Oscar-winning Glory, directed by Ed Zwick, that won Denzel Washington his first Oscar. There's a troubled film called Navy SEALs starring Charlie Sheen he'd also written. That turned into a decent computer game, actually. He also had a story credit on the second Rambo movie. So he had some cachet and he was building up. And he was also building up to directing. This was what he wanted to do. And the news broke by the end of 1992 that there was a studio after his Tombstone script. That it was in the Hollywood Reporter that said Universal Pictures was now working with Kevin Jarre about a film to do with Wyatt Earp and the 1881 gunfight at the OK Corral. It was known already at this stage that Jarre wasn't just writing the script, he was set to make his directorial debut, and in fact the casting work was soon underway. One of the first offers went to Kevin Costner. Now, Kevin Costner, a fairly logical choice if you're going to have a blockbuster of sorts western in the early 1990s. Dances with Wolves had, of course, won him Oscars and made him mega money as well. And he'd not been shy about talking up his love of westerns. He'd done Silverado before. What a film Silverado is. I'm coming to that in the future, actually. But at this point, he had a commitment, or at least an inkling towards a television miniseries telling the Wyatt Earp story. And so Costner wasn't heading for the Tombstone script. He already had this TV project that he was interested in doing. Well, as much as it was December 1992 that the news broke of this film happening, by February 1993, just 2 months later, and remarkably 10 months before the film was in cinemas, this is a very fast film story, Universal was out. That even though the project had attracted quite a cast by this point, and I'll come to them just in a second, the $20 million budget that was going to be required to make the film, well, the studio was having second thoughts about it all. Now, the script had attracted interest. It had brought in people like Kurt Russell, Val Kilmer, Sam Elliott. A young Brendan Fraser was also interested as well. And it was the script that Kevin Jarre had written that was bringing people in. Val Kilmer in his memoir, which I've just got a copy of right here. There you go. Listen to that. I'm Your Huckleberry. He says that he'd basically only read half the screenplay before he decided to say yes to the film. And he says he's done that 3 times in his career. The first was for Batman Forever. Well, in fact, the first was for Tombstone, wasn't it? The second was for Batman Forever. The third was for Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. And so the film was back on the market with this 20 million budget needed to make it. And I mean, this is where the indies came in. So indie studios in Hollywood in the early 1990s, headed up by the cash-rich Carol Co., or certainly the big spenders Carol Co., were getting quite a few films through the system. So in 1991, two of the biggest films of that summer, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves and Terminator 2 Judgment Day, were both basically independent films that studios came in to help distribute afterwards. There were three parties in the end that were said to be primarily interested in taking the Tombstone project on from Universal, and, it was pretty much ready to go. They were Synergy, Carol Co. and Interscope Communications. Whichever one won out was going to have to find at least $20 million for the film, and it was Synergy, apparently Kurt Russell brought them to the table, who committed $20 to $25 million to the project. Synergy had a distribution deal in place with Hollywood Pictures, basically a part of Disney, and so American distribution was sorted as well. And then overseas rights would then be sold on. So that would help bring in some of the funds required to cover the budget. In fact, I think $32.5 million of overseas sales certainly helped grease the wheels. And it was also helpful for Synergy that it was basically able to sell two films at once, that it sold overseas rights for its erotic thriller Colour of Night, starring Bruce Willis. Not a great film, but that notwithstanding, Bruce Willis's name was selling overseas, even Bruce Willis in an erotic thriller. That film did not come out particularly well, perhaps a story for another time. And so Tombstone was heading to the starting blocks, but Kevin Costner was rumbling because his television miniseries had now evolved, and he was committing to what would be a rival film, Wyatt Earp. Now, this was going to be backed by Warner Brothers. It was going to be directed by his longtime collaborator Lawrence Kasdan, who directed him in and cut him out of The Big Chill. And Warner Brothers backing it. This was going to have a much bigger budget as well. Costner at this point in the early 1990s, one of the, if not the biggest movie star in the world, that all of a sudden became the running favourite. And I mean, it certainly lit a fire under Tombstone as well. It got to the point where this nearly led to Tombstone being shut down. In fact, if we go back to why Universal backed out of the film, it was said that the existence of this rival project was what spooked Universal. As much as Dances with Wolves had cut through and Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven had done good business as well, Westerns were not in abundance at the box office, and the thought of, you might get away with one, but two on the same subject, well, both of them couldn't succeed, and Universal just figured the one with the big movie star, that's the one that's going to win out. Now, for Kevin Shah, this was all a bit of deja vu, because right at the start of the 1990s, Universal actually picked up a different script for him, a Dracula film. That was a good idea. Problem was that Francis Ford Coppola then started his own Dracula film based on James V. Hart's script, coming to him in the second half of this episode, just briefly. And so Universal backed out of the Dracula project. In fact, Kevin Shah was really not particularly happy with the rival Wyatt Earp project. Costner's move was, he said at the time, quote, an attempt to crush my picture. However, there was something very, very much in Tombstone's favour as we went into early 1993. That unlike Wyatt Earp, Tombstone was ready to go. It had a cast. The locations had been scouted. It had a writer-director. The script had been worked on for a long, long, long time. The script had brought in this heavyweight cast of actors. And so, it came to, here's your opportunity. You can pick up this film for 20, 25 million, but you've got to get it out into the world before Kevin Costner and Wyatt Earp came along. It's worth noting that in 1991, going back to Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, that was up against a couple of rival Robin Hood projects, one of which shut down entirely. The other was reshaped for television as soon as it became clear that the Kevin Costner headline version was going. This was history repeating itself, and the chances of anyone winning out in a battle with Costner's version were slim. In fact, the whole rivalry had affected the casting to a degree as well, because in the early 1990s, CAA, Creative Artists Agency, was the powerhouse agency, the powerhouse talent agency in Hollywood, headed up by mogul Michael Ovitz, who would eventually quit, take over Disney in an ill-fated reign there. But CAA had Kevin Costner on its books, and so was clearly putting its weight in the Lawrence Kasdan Warner Brothers Wyatt Earp movie. And that meant if you were a client of CAA, the chances of you getting the lead in the other film were not high. It wasn't going to be pitching stars to appear in Tombstone against its treasured clients project instead. And so Kurt Russell was apparently on the CAA books, and the only reason that it really came onto his radar is one of the filmmakers managed to slip him the script. And thus Russell saw it, decided he wanted to do it, and that then led to the whole build-up that saw Synergy putting its money into the film and Tombstone actually happening. But boy, was it happening fast. So this was all taking place at the start of 1993. Filming had been due to start in March of 1993, but they'd had to find the funding again. They'd had to cement it all. Still, they got to the point where, this was now actually going to happen. There's going to be delay in the start of production. It was going to have to hit a December 1993 release date. That was pretty much non-negotiable. Any later, the film would have to be pushed to the following summer, and then it's right in the crosshairs of the Costner picture and the Lawrence Kasdan film. So rehearsals came together. In fact, Kilmer just said there weren't really early signs of problems there, because Kilmer wrote rehearsals were hilarious. Talked about how there were 5 or 6 actors who played leads in blockbusters, and just many times during rehearsals, very small parts seems to become what the whole film was about. There was this cast of people who were used to the camera being trained on them, and all of a sudden it was a bit more of a battle. 2 months behind schedule then, in Arizona, May 1993, filming could begin. Again, the film had to be in cinemas 7 months from this point. Now, 7 months in the analog era, where you had to strike prints on film and ship cans all around the country, you can wipe 2-3 weeks out of that as well. This film had to be absolutely locked by mid-November? They barely 6 months or so, really, start to finish to do it. This production needed to be smooth and on time. Well, one of those two things wasn't going to happen. Now, it was a first-time director, it's worth noting that, and as Synergy's head Andrew Wagner would say, if we weren't afraid with a first-time director, we'd all be nuts. But Kevin Jarre knew the film he wanted to make, and authenticity was key. Val Kilmer would talk about how Jarre insisted the actors wear real wool costumes. Bit of a challenge, given how hot the location was. But still, he was very precise about what he wanted. He'd worked on the script. Within days, the problems were mounting up. For whatever reason, and there are all sorts of rumours and stories surrounding Tombstone, I don't think there's a definitive take, but there's lots of opinions on it. Kevin Jarre didn't seem to have a handle on directing the film. Could it have been his own demons? Was this studio interference? Whatever it was, Jarre's time on the project was fast coming to an end. In fact, Entertainment Weekly picked over the movie back in December 1993, just as it was heading to release. And, frustrations were rife. The cinematographer of the film, multiple Oscar nominee William Fraker, had apparently quit 3 times. Sam Elliott would talk about how he knew, quote, from the 3rd day Kevin couldn't direct. He wasn't getting the shots he needed. Now, also, Val Kilmer and Kurt Russell were worried. Kilmer writes in his book that he knew quickly they were in trouble. And he said, Kurt looked me straight in the eye and said, Val, we're in trouble. Told you they were in trouble. On Kevin Jarre's side was Michael Rooker. Now, Rooker in the Entertainment Weekly piece insisted from the beginning they allotted too little time to do this movie. Kevin was trying to do it in the amount of time contracted for, which was way underestimated. No way in hell could this be done, and just not possible. The problem was the shots that Jarre was getting, they weren't working. He was taking a lot of time to get those shots. And 4 weeks into shooting, Andrew Wagner just pulled the trapdoor. He fired the director of the film. He didn't change the release date. This wasn't a movie studio that could juggle things around. Synergy's an independent. It had promised to deliver this film. It didn't have a massive slate of pictures. The film needed to be finished. George Cosmatos, who'd enjoyed success a few years prior with Rambo First Blood Part 2, was parachuted in with 2-3 days of preparation to take the film on. And it was going to be a savage retooling of the movie that took place 4 weeks into filming. 17 members of the crew would leave or be fired when Cosmatos came in. Catherine Hardwicke, actually, a previous guest of Film Stories, she'd go on to direct Twilight, but she was a production designer who stuck this one out. She made it to the end. But lots of the cast went. The studio, meanwhile, wasn't offering any more time or money. That meant the script had to come down. It had to be reworked. There wasn't time to film everything in there, what with these delays mounting up. So one of the producers was James Jacks. And along with Kurt Russell, Jacks and Russell set about hacking that script back as Cosmatos got the shots that he needed. There was a cast of 85 characters in the original script for this, and Russell would, by folklore, step into basically a surrogate director role on the film. This has never been outright confirmed, but has been talked about by several people involved, that he was coming up with the shot lists at one point, according to one story. Also, I mean, Val Kilmer said he had input on the script. Russell was certainly having input on the script, and they were pulling it back and pulling it back and pulling it back, and not everybody was happy with what was being cut. Go back to the rehearsals. We had 5-6 actors used to having the lead in a film, and now their roles are being cut back by one of the people who is the lead in the film. And so people were sneaking their lines back into some of the scenes that Cosmatos was shooting. But still, this nuanced script that Kevin Shah had put together was by necessity coming down, and a lot of that nuance was just disappearing. Inevitably, it wasn't particularly a happy place to be. But on August the 29th, the film wrapped production. So this had start to finish, 4.5 months of shooting. In the end, $2 million over budget, but there was still that deadline. Hollywood Pictures wanted this for Christmas Day. And already it was a very different feel of film, really, from the one that had started shooting all the way back in May of that year. I mean, the post-production was just as savage. I mean, one of the people shut out the editing room was said to be producer James Jacks, and it was getting the movie down to the final running time actually of Tombstone, a lot leaner than Wyatt Earp, which I'll come to in a second. 130 minutes, 3 credited editors: Frank J. Urioste, Roberto Silvi, Harvey Rosenstock. And I mean, it almost a miracle, really, that the film got made. But people were not happy. I mean, Sam Elliott would talk about it, and he just said initially the screenplay was one of the best I've ever read. And he said, if I was given the screenplay as it is now, I'd have to pass on it. They took 29 pages out of it. 29 pages out of it. Eliminated the connective tissue, took the character development out, and made it, it made it a far more straightforward blockbuster film. Still had this amazing cast to it. But, I mean, it was, again, quite a different film. Would it work, though? Because there was this race to get it into cinemas, and by now it was known that Wyatt Earp was going to appear in June of 1994, and Tombstone was going to go into cinemas in a really competitive Christmas market. I mean, The Pelican Brief was around at that point, which was Julia Roberts' big return to movies in a John Grisham adaptation. Mrs. Doubtfire was around. So, first of all, it's the critical response to it. The movie debuted on Christmas Day in America, by which point the critics had pretty much been on its side, actually. That, some people really, really went for the film and enjoyed it a lot. And also, there were performances that were really being praised. Val Kilmer in particular got a lot of praise for it. And the worst reviews coming in were still mixed. We're still saying this was entertaining. There was still another film in there that we ultimately didn't get to see, but by God, Hollywood Pictures got it into cinemas, and with the critics pretty much on side. So that opening weekend, it opened Christmas week, December the 24th to the 30th, 1993. There's Tombstone in third place, 14.4 million opening weekend. Again, a competitive period. Mrs. Doubtfire was on its 6th week of release and was still topping the chart, 26.3 million. The Pelican Brief had come out the week before, 23 million. Other films in the top 10 that week, Sister Act 2, a notable box office disappointment that was actually. Beethoven's Second, Universal did a Best Picture campaigning ad for the Oscars for 1994 and included Beethoven's Second on it. I mean, crikey. The reunion of Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau in Grumpy Old Men, that was in 6th place, 9.4 million. Wayne's World 2, another box office underperformer, 8.9 million. Another Western, Geronimo, an American Legend, that was in 8th place. The Piano was in 9th. The Three Musketeers was in 10th. The other opening film that week, well, apart from the low screen count Oscar fare, Oliver Stone's Heaven and Earth and Jonathan Demme's Philadelphia, was on 1,500 screens one of the best Batman movies of all time. I'm coming to it shortly on this podcast, Batman Mask of the Phantasm. That sat in 12th place. Tombstone, though, in 3rd. And the following week, Tombstone in 3rd. I mean, it held its position with another 11.9 million. Let's go to the week after. Tombstone in 3rd. It held its position again, 8.5 million. There weren't a lot of new opening films coming around at this point, but Tombstone, I mean, it had a really good month in American cinemas, actually. It only dropped on its 4th week down out of the top 5. And by the time it was done in US cinemas, this movie that had cost, again, $25 million to make, had helped itself to 56 million in the US alone. Outside of the US, Westerns didn't tend to travel particularly well. This one didn't do too bad. It added, another 17, 18 million, something like that. I'm just checking my maths on the fly here. For a total global box office take of $73.2 million, and then it would be a video hit after that. So it certainly just put the gauntlet down for Wyatt Earp, which, I'll come to in a future episode. But Wyatt Earp was what Tombstone wasn't. The original draft of Tombstone was a lot longer. Well, Wyatt Earp's running time, 190 minutes. Tombstone's budget, relatively slim at 25 million. Wyatt Earp's 63 million. The two films basically made roughly the same. In fact, if anything, Tombstone just slightly outgrossed Wyatt Earp. Michael Madsen, I believe, was originally in the Tombstone ensemble, and then he jumped over to the Lawrence Kasdan Wyatt Earp film. I like both films, so, I got no skin in this game. I didn't really pay for either of them, so I just get to watch them. But it's only in the years after that, the legend of what it could have been has kind of bubbled up quite a lot. And I mentioned True West magazine at the start, and I do recommend giving them a Google and just having a look at some of the extensive writing on Tombstone that particular outlet has done. But, there was a degree of post-mortem to it. Kurt Russell, even around the time, said, I don't know if Kevin would have been able to realise the film he had in his mind. He said, we might still be shooting this movie. I helped him by making sure we got the movie made, and I feel good about it. We busted our ass. But Kevin Jarre was said to have been pretty much broken by having Tombstone taken away from him. And not a nice story, really, not a nice thing to go through at all. In fact, the next film that he wrote was The Devil's Own, which would be directed by Alan J. Pakula, would star Brad Pitt and Harrison Ford. And again, that was a script that was heavily overhauled through a troubled production. And that too left him not on the happy side of life at all. And he would eventually pass, only in his 50s, in 2011. Over time, the film that he set on the path into existence would continue to build its audience. I've seen it described as a cult hit, really. I think it's a bit different to that, because I think it hit on its original release, but it's just continued to find an audience. But also a lot of the discussion has been around the stuff that we didn't see. Did Kurt Russell ghost direct the movie? How much of this film did George Cosmatos actually direct? How many of Kevin Jarre's shots are in the film? And also, it's only like in the last 7 or 8 years that people have been a little bit more candid about it. That Kurt Russell talked to Bill Simmons in 2017, and he just said it was unfortunate on that film that our director, he was a spectacular writer and he was as weak a director as he was a good writer. And he just said he was a good writer and he was getting his opportunity to direct and it was just not working. And Russell said at that point that a lot of the production of Tombstone, quote, fell on my shoulders. And Val Kilmer on his website addressed Tombstone in 2017. He'd resisted the questions over time, but he wrote that I've been asked several questions about working on the set of Tombstone and about Kurt Russell's role in bringing the film home. He wrote that there were rumours that the set of Tombstone was quite tumultuous and that Kurt Russell basically directed the film. What was your experience on set? Did Kurt Russell actually direct Tombstone? And I mean, as someone put to him, I read about the conflict on the set, but I'm not sure who to believe. And Kilmer just said, I'll be clear, Kurt is solely responsible for Tombstone's success, no question. I mean, he added that I was there every minute. And although Kurt's version differs slightly from mine in the telling of the story, the one thing he's totally correct about is how hard he worked the day before for the next day's shot list and tremendous effort he and I both put into editing, as the studio wouldn't give us any extra time to make up for the whole month, the month that we lost with the first director. So again, go back, May 1993 it started shooting. They had 6 months to do it, basically, and they lost a month in the midst of it. And as Kilmer said, I watched Kurt sacrifice his own role and energy to devote himself as a storyteller, even going so far as to draw up shot lists to help our replacement director, George Cosmatos, who came in with only 2 days prep. Which begs the question, is there a very, very different cut of Tombstone out there somewhere? I mean, clearly it's not a Kevin Jarre cut because, I mean, sadly he passed, and also he only got to shoot 4 weeks of the movie and the bulk of it was filmed by someone else. But given how fast the editing had to go, given how much material they must have had at some point, could there be another take on it? The original screenplay that that Kevin Jarre wrote is out there on the internet. There is a full making of Tombstone book that's gone out into the world as well. And, you know, in the midst of the battle, none of this has happened for the Wyatt Earp film either. It's Tombstone, after all this time, the one that's talked about the most. It had arguably the better time in front of the camera, the worst time behind the camera, and also, I'd suggest, probably the best legacy of the two.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Which brings me to the halfway point of this episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. I'm going into my parish notices now and a few things to tell you about. Firstly, I've done more print magazines, print film magazines. They are an endangered species, which is why independents such as myself have picked up the mantle a little bit. So Film Stories issue 52 leads with a huge interview with Ridley Scott. Now, ostensibly, this is about Gladiator 2, but also we are talking, I mean, we figured lots of people would talk Gladiator 2. So we asked Ridley Scott a lot about Ridley Scott, and you will find bits about his process, about, his Ridleygrams, about the time he went to visit the set of Alien 3. Never knew any of that. That's all in the new issue, as well as a whole bunch on independent and low-budget filmmaking, stories of making films. I mean, it's 168 pages. You can find it at store.filmstories.co.uk. At that very same place, you can find the new issue of Film Junior magazine as well, which is headlined by Paddington in Peru, which is just on the eve of release as this podcast is being recorded and reported. Now, Film Junior is a print film magazine for under 15s, and I mean, they write it and get paid for it as well. You can find that at store.filmstories.co.uk. As for this podcast, I mean, if you like it and don't mind, I thank you so much for listening in the first instance. That's such a huge thing and much appreciated. If you want to give it even more support and no expectation, anything much received, look, financially, you can go to patreon.com/SimonBrew. If you put money in there, you get the podcast early pretty much every week. You get it ad-free. You find out the gossip of what I'm up to behind the scenes, and also take advantage of the new chat feature that I've just realised is on Patreon, so I'm being asked lots of questions on there. That's patreon.com/SimonBrew. Costing you absolutely zero is to subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice, and also if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, stuff like that helps independent podcasts beat the algorithms of major international conglomerates who otherwise hate our guts, happy times. Thank you to everyone doing any of that. It is much appreciated. And that is the end of the parish notices, because I want to get on with the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. It's about time I had the Muppets back on. Here's a clip from the trailer of one of their films. I'm going to come to the tail of it the other side of this.
Centuries ago, a legendary treasure was buried on a remote island. And there's only one living soul daring enough to find it.
Hello, everyone.
Captain Abraham Smollett is taking command.
This voyage has begun.
To wherever the wind may take us.
Hurry, Rizzo!
I'm going as fast as I can.
But there's trouble afoot.
Beware the one-legged man. He's the one to fear.
Long John Silver, at your service.
One leg, Jim. Count 'em one.
Now, the captain is being pursued by pirates.
Pirates?
We're sailing for buried treasure.
We're gonna be rich.
We're gonna be dead.
Surrounded by danger.
Terrific. Captured by crazed wild pigs and sacrificed hideously before a pagan altar.
Are we lucky or what?
And haunted by his past.
That was a clip from Muppet Treasure Island, dating all the way back to 1996, directed by Brian Henson, screenplay by Jerry Jewell, Kirk Thatcher and James V. Hart, and starring Kevin Bishop, Tim Curry, Dave Goltz, Steve Whitmire, Jerry Nelson, Kevin Clash, Bill Barretta, Frank Oz, many of those the Muppet performers, of course. So, I mean, the story of Muppet Treasure Island, we have to go back to 1992's The Muppet Christmas Carol, a triumphant return to the big screen for the Muppets, and a real transitional film for them as well. The Muppet Christmas Carol, which I've talked about previously, was the first big Muppet project really since the tragic loss of Jim Henson in 1990, that his son Brian stepped up to direct the picture. And I mean, it was a decent box office hit at the time. Now it's a bona fide Christmas classic. And so it also opened up a different way of doing Muppets films. So you go through the history of the Muppets, the Muppet movie, the Great Muppets Caper, the Muppets Take Manhattan. And the idea was this time that you start doing Muppet films based around classic literature. You Muppetify, is that a word? I've just made it a word, an existing story. So, I mean, Brian Henson was interested in doing another film. In fact, it didn't take long for the announcement of another Muppet picture to come together. I mean, he's in his 30s, very early 30s at this point as well. And he knew that at heart they wanted to do another classic story into a film. They liked the idea of taking something that people already knew, but it wasn't determined straight away that it was going to be Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island that bubbled up to the top. It was just one of many ideas that was being chatted about at Muppet HQ, at the Jim Henson Company. And one of the people who was really championing the idea of doing Treasure Island was the writer Kirk Thatcher. He saw plenty in it, not least the idea of doing a pirate film or something like that. Thatcher at this point he'd been working on the kids' TV series Dinosaurs that ran for several years. He wasn't heavily in the Muppets world, but he was one of those trying to come up, crack really which way this should go. And so, I mean, he talked about that when the decision was made to go with Treasure Island, he was absolutely in prime position to do it. He loved also the idea of you take the disparate... I mean, pirate films have so many disparate characters, and he knew that if they're doing a Muppet film, well, straight away you've got 5 major characters that you've got to weave into roles. You've also got, 12 supporting characters, he figured, and they each needed something to do. If you put them all on a big boat and got lots of pirates and a lot of quirky characters, well, that might work. But it was taking a long time to get this script right. It got to a point where Brian Henson said he wasn't going to cut his hair until it was all done, given how long it took to come together. Thatcher would work with Jerry Jewell, the original Muppet writer. He'd penned Muppet Christmas Carol, worked on The Muppet Show and written so much for the Muppets, knew them inside out, really. In the end, James V. Hart would come in as well, but I'll talk about him shortly, because in May of 1993, 6 months after the release of The Muppet Christmas Carol, we got the formal announcement of Muppet Treasure Island. Now, this came directly from the Jim Henson Company. Interestingly, it announced the film without a distributor on board. There wasn't a studio backer for this picture. That Jim Henson Company was effectively an independent, and so Disney was the incumbent, but it was not definite that Disney was going to be the distributor of the film. It's just very, very likely. The official announcement then, going back to May of 1993, declared from Brian Henson that we're less faithful to the original novel this time than we were with Muppet Christmas Carol. He said it's a bit more Muppetised and we twist the plot a bit more. That the budget wasn't being discussed, but it was going to be the same kind of modest cost, really, of the Muppet Christmas Carol. But also in that announcement was a different take on the story than we would ultimately get in the finished film. We'll get into that in a second. But the headline of it was that the description saw the great Gonzo and his sidekick Rizzo, who narrated and told the story of Muppet Christmas Carol, would jointly take on the original part of adventurous lad Jim Hawkins. So the lead role was going to be split between the two of them. One of them would be called Jim, one would be called Hawkins. Casting of the central character Long John Silver has not been announced, they said, but the company is looking for a major star. Now, Disney had inked, as this announcement noted, a first look deal with the Henson Company. So the plan in the end was that the studio would pick it up. But also in that announcement, it talks about, in the trade press report of it, the idea was get the film in front of the cameras towards the end of 1993 and then have it released in 1994. Well, that just didn't happen because it took them so long to crack the script. So Jerry Jewell and Kurt Thatcher got into a way of working that Jewell would sit at the computer, Thatcher would sit at the couch, and they would move ideas backwards and forwards. And it took, about 9 months to a year they worked with so many different versions of this before they cracked the direction of the story. And then right before the end, they brought in James V. Hart, who'd written Hook for Steven Spielberg, had written Bram Stoker's Dracula. I mentioned him earlier. He came in to do basically the final polish on the movie. And so they did eventually have the script together. But again, it had changed from that original announcement that no longer was it Gonzo and Rizzo as Jim and Hawkins, because what Brian Henson realised was at heart the story of Muppet Treasure Island was about Jim Hawkins, the boy becoming a man. And in fact, by this point, Disney was involved, and Disney wasn't taken with the idea really of splitting that lead character either. And so the script was reworked, several times to have just this singular lead, this singular Jim Hawkins in there. Now, the writing continued. I mean, there was a point, Kurt Thatcher's on YouTube, and he talks about this. It was a really quite interesting interview about how when you get to the middle of the movie, things can sometimes get a little bit dull and just you're sort of heading towards the end and setting all that up, and you can get bogged down. And so they had this idea to put this huge production number in the middle of it all, this song Cabin Fever, where they could go completely mad, really. And basically at the point in the movie where the gas could go out of it, they could give it a proper Muppety refuel. The first person to audition for the role of Jim Hawkins was Kevin Bishop, a young actor who had just been working in Grange Hill. And I interviewed him years ago, actually. I mean, he's a stand-up comedian now, he's acted in a lot of other stuff. And he talked about the bit where he got the Muppet role. He said it worked in my favour how things panned out for him, because he said, I worked on Grange Hill for 2 years. I know that this is the BBC TV series Grange Hill. If you're not familiar with it, it was huge for a long time. And he said, I was so unruly that they expelled me from a fictional school. They sacked me from Grange Hill. And I remember my parents were really embarrassed that I'd been sacked from this school. And he just said it was Boreham Wood in Elstree, really. And I remember all the kids saying, that was it. My career was over. You've been sacked. And he says, within a couple of months, I was in Muppet Treasure Island. And he talked about it was an incredible experience working with Tim Curry, Jennifer Saunders, Billy Connolly, Kermit the Frog, Miss Piggy. And he just said it was brilliant. I will never forget those days. Again, the first to audition for him. On the song front, slightly different personnel came in to do the music. It wasn't the Muppet Christmas Carol team, and instead it was Barry Mann and Cynthia Well came in to do the songs. And as producer Martin Baker said, we didn't know how they would work in terms of the Muppets, but after a couple of meetings it started to click, and they just said it's just been a dream. They've written some wonderful songs, and they also brought in to write the score for Muppet Treasure Island a man called Hans Zimmer. Wonder what on earth happened to him. If the idea had been to get this film shooting at the end of 1993, that plan clearly hadn't panned out, and it was actually in April 1995 at Shepperton Studios in the UK that production began. Now, the Muppets have had the UK as their home for a long time, and so here we were again in the UK shooting a Muppet production, making, I mean, the sheer amount of work that goes into make a Muppet film. I've been behind the scenes of one of them, and I've just seen I mean, the Muppet crafting, the crafting of the characters that they hide away in cupboards and just bring out. I mean, I think I was shown actually a Michael Caine Muppet that was in the background of Muppet Treasure Island too, and I'd never seen it in the film, but I've seen the actual Muppet that was done. And I mean, Brian Henson talks about how the crew usually enjoys making a Muppet film because, film crews don't usually work on projects such as this. But then he also dispelled the myth that crews sometimes have, that they come to it and think, oh, it's going to be easy. But actually, he reconciles it's not, because every shot in a Muppet film is a special effect. And they're really, really difficult to make. And so, for instance, there are a couple of big musical numbers, Cabin Fever 1, Sailing for Adventure another. And for that, they had over 40 Muppets that were being used for those numbers that required 25 puppeteers on top of the usual crew to be brought in to realise those particular sequences. It's only when they did Muppets Most Wanted, really, that they were having to get even greater numbers in to do scenes such as that. They had built this massive boat as well. That production designer Val Trotzober had gone full the hunt for Red October and basically built this full-size ship that was mounted on a gimbal in the studio. It wasn't out at sea, spoilers. But what it meant was Brian Henson was a little bit wary, given how much they were going to rock this ship, that his cast and crew would get seasick. And so he told people apparently to take special seasick medication just to counter that. The problem was that it had a side effect, that it got people drowsy. And Tim Curry in video interviews for Muppet Treasure Island would talk about this, how just like you just starting to doze off. Now, for the puppeteers, of course, the challenge was keeping going when you've got your arm up in the air and a weight on the arm as well, having to put your performance on screen whilst not basically being able to see anything other than a monitor to the side to you and waving your arm in the air. I've trivialised completely the art of puppeteering there. A couple of the characters had to be worked by more than one person, and also, there's a sequence in the film where we find Kermit and Miss Piggy upside down, and the amount of work to realise that was comfortably one of the trickiest shots to do in the film, with a lot of strings that needed to be painted out afterwards. For the shots of the boat at sea, it's no spoiler to say there is a boat and there is sea in Muppet Treasure Island. What they did is they built a 12-foot version of the ship. They composited that on shots of the Caribbean. Now, the vast majority of the production took place in London, but a visual effects producer and a tiny crew did go off on a yacht to the sunsets of the Caribbean to shoot footage there, while everyone else shivered it in London. It's quite interesting hearing people talking about acting on a Muppet film. And in the case of Muppet Treasure Island, they're fairly open about the fact that there's competition among performers, not nasty or anything like that, but if you're acting against a Muppet, you have to go big. And the puppeteers would go big against each other as well. Tim Curry also joining in the fun as well. One person who wasn't there as much as usual was Frank Oz. The joyful puppeteering of Miss Piggy and Fozzie Bear, amongst the many terrific characters that Frank Oz has brought to life. He was off at this stage directing another film. So what he'd done is Kevin Clash came in to do the puppeteering on camera, but Oz had done a read through of the script as well, so Clash had that as reference, and then in post-production Frank Oz would come back and re-record the voices of the characters. Now, going back to the interview I did with Kevin Bishop many years ago, I did ask him about just what is actually the physicality of being on the set with the Muppets. And he just says, I don't think people realise that what you see with the Muppets isn't necessarily how it's done. You've got 5-foot trenches everywhere across the whole of the stage with Muppet performers in them with their microphones on. And he described it as quite treacherous. Because he said when you're acting, you can't look at your feet all the time and look where you're going, because that's not good acting. And he says, I remember one scene, the choreographer fell completely down a hole and landed on a monitor on her backside and was really injured. And he just said it was really dangerous. He also said, energy-wise, one slight movement of a puppeteer's hand and a puppet becomes very animated, and as a result, energy levels have to be up the whole time, else you just look like you've got no energy. And Bishop said, I think it was Tim Curry who struggled with it, although that might be to do with the medication that was making it drowsy, really. For Kevin Bishop singing in the film, meanwhile, he was of an age where his voice was changing as well. And so as much as he did singing on set, what they actually went with in the end was his audition, that he did his audition work in a recording studio, and they overdubbed his singing with some of those audition performances as well. Still, as physical and taxing as the film was, it was all wrapped up for July of 1995, and the post-production would involve tidying up a lot of those strings and making sure things that you don't want to be seen are not being seen. But the film was in post-production, and Disney had given it a not massively ambitious release date of February the 16th, 1996. Michael Jablow edited the movie, and I mean, no great drama that I could find really in the post-production, short of having to redub some of the performances, as previously mentioned. And so it was before critics then, and I mean, critics just, it's a Muppets film, and they kind of warmed to the joy of it, really, that inevitably the yardstick was Muppet Christmas Carol, and the feeling was it wasn't quite as good as Muppet Christmas Carol, but I mean, also not quite as successful a project, but still an awful lot to like in it. And not quite as comfortable a union of Muppets and a classic story that you were getting here, but still, on the whole, it worked. The music's a lot of fun, the performances are fun, and generally the response to it was on the positive side, just far from euphoric. In terms of the financials, the Muppet Christmas Carol, I mean, sometimes it's easy to think that it was a massive box office success. It cost $12 million to make, and it took $27 million in the US on its original release, and only a couple of million more outside of the US first time round. And so I guess that was really the measuring stick where Muppet Treasure Island was concerned. And when it opened on February the 16th to the 18th with $7.9 million, that was a pretty decent start, really. A fairly competitive week as well, that Disney actually opened 2 pictures that weekend. That it opened a family film by the name of Mr. Wrong. Anyone remember that? Exactly. That was down in 6th place with a $5 million opening. It also had Mr. Holland's Opus in 5th place, another Disney film that was on its 8th week of release. But Broken Arrow was leading the chart as well on its 2nd week with 11 million. Happy Gilmore opened in 2nd place with 8.5. There was Muppet Treasure Island, 7.9 million. And then City Hall down in 4th place for 6.9 million. Al Pacino mentions that in his recent memoir, Sonny Boy, incidentally. Would Muppets hold its audience is generally the question, and Muppet films tend to. I mean, it only dropped 17.5% in its second weekend on release, adding another 6.5%, holding on to third place as Rumble in the Bronx came along and took the top spot. Also out that week, actually, that on the second week of its release, was Mary Riley, starring Julia Roberts, directed by Stephen Frears, and that is a film story and a half I will come to in the future. The following week, well, I mean, Muppets started to drop a little bit. Up close, some personal, Robert Redford and Michelle Pfeiffer, that opened in first place. Down Periscope was in second. And so, I mean, the Muppets just hung around for, I mean, they were in cinemas on and off for quite a while, but Muppet Treasure Island's box office, 34.3 million in the US on its initial release. That put it ahead of the Muppets Christmas Carol by $6-7 million, and in fact, only three of the other Muppet films have ever outgrossed it: The Muppets, The Muppet Movie, and Muppets Most Wanted. Outside of the US, same drill, did solid business, and by the time its run was completed around the world, 47.2 million was the total in the bank. What happened afterwards? Well, a couple of things. Number one, first of all, the film got sued by Hormel Foods Corporation, who didn't particularly enjoy the fact that there's a warthog in Muppets Christmas Carol called Spam. Now, Hormel Foods Corporation makes Spam, as in the meat product, wasn't particularly pleased, sued and lost, had the case dismissed in court. As for the Muppets, the idea of adapting more classic stories, well, that sort of fell by the wayside a little bit, and they wouldn't return to the big screen for, until 1999 with the movie Muppets from Space. Now, I'm not a mad fan of Muppets from Space, actually, but this one wasn't distributed by Disney. It wasn't directed by Brian Henson either. Tim Hill came in to do it. He would go on to do Garfield movies. Had a lot of the Muppets team attached to it, but I don't know. Maybe, again, I'll come to it in the future. But that one didn't hit the same kind of box office numbers as Muppet Treasure Island, and it took the Muppets away from the big screen for a long time. Muppet Treasure Island, I mean, it's almost the overlooked Muppet film, really. I still think it's an awful lot of fun. I think the songbook and the score is really good stuff as well. Dwarfed perhaps a little bit by Muppet Christmas Carol, but what you get for your money is, 100 minutes of Muppet mayhem and a fair amount of it as well for your cash. Always been a fan of the film. I wish they'd go back and do some of the classic stories again, but sort of do them properly in the way that they did. For now, we got this. We got Muppet Christmas Carol. That ain't a bad double bill, is it? And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you so much, as always, for listening, and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me personally on Twitter and Blue Sky at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories. We're at Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. You can find my ugly mug on YouTube at youtube.com/Film Stories. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that is our online shop. I did a lot of that in the parish notices in the middle of this episode, so I won't go on again. And then our website, filmstories.co.uk, is our clickbait-free entertainment website. We do films, TV, we do reviews, features, news, things like that. Again, thanks so much for all the support we've been getting there. We're getting a growing number of people who are seeing what we're trying to do, and we're swimming a lot against the tide. So thank you to everyone who's just given us a bit of a leg up. But I think I've comfortably outstayed my welcome. So for now, I'm going to leave you in peace. I thank you for your time. I thank you for listening. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Thanks for listening all. Take care. Bye-bye.